Welcome to Artificial Fictions. I post new scary stories that were written by artificial intelligence. I hope you enjoy them. It was a dark and stormy night, and Emily was driving home from a long day at work. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was howling so loudly she could barely hear herself think. She was relieved when she finally pulled up to her house, but as she stepped out of the car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She hurried inside and locked the door behind her, but the feeling only intensified. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but then she heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. She turned around slowly, dreading what she might see, and saw a pale face pressed up against the glass, its eyes fixed on her. Emily screamed and stumbled backwards, falling to the floor. When she looked up again, the face was gone. She shook her head, convinced she had imagined it, and started to get up, but then she heard footsteps coming from upstairs. Heavy, dragging footsteps that seemed to be getting closer and closer. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The footsteps grew louder and louder until they were right behind her, and then she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She spun around to face her attacker, but there was no one there. Emily ran through the house, trying to find a place to hide, but every room she entered seemed to be occupied by a different nightmare. In one, there were spiders crawling all over the walls. In another, a ghostly figure floated above the bed. And in the basement, she found a room full of creepy dolls that seemed to be watching her every move. Just when Emily thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard a knock at the door. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should answer it, but then the knocking grew more insistent. She opened the door to find a police officer on the other side. "Ma'am, we've been getting reports of strange activity in this area," the officer said. "We're here to investigate. Are you okay?" Emily nodded, grateful for the officer's presence, but as she turned back towards the house, she heard a voice whisper in her ear, "You're not safe yet." She spun around, but there was no one there. The officer looked at her curiously, but Emily just shook her head and led him inside. As they walked through the house, Emily tried to ignore the feeling of eyes on her back, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. She led the officer to the basement, hoping to prove that everything was okay. But when they got there, they found a hidden door that led to a secret room. Inside, they found evidence of something truly horrifying, a shrine dedicated to Emily, filled with pictures of her and strange symbols scrawled on the walls. The officer's face turned pale and he called for backup. As they waited for backup to arrive, Emily couldn't help but wonder who had been watching her and why, and would they ever be caught? It was a hot summer night, and Sarah was sitting on her porch, enjoying the breeze. She had just moved to a new town, and she was still getting used to the strange sounds and unfamiliar surroundings. As she sat there, sipping her iced tea, she heard a soft whispering sound coming from the bushes. She peered into the darkness, but she couldn't see anything. She shrugged it off and went back to her drink, but the whispering continued. Suddenly, the whispering turned into a low, growling sound, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She stood up and started to walk back into the house, but then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around, but there was no one there. Sarah ran inside and locked the door behind her, but the growling sound persisted. She tried to call the police, but her phone was dead. She was trapped. As she sat there, listening to the growling sound getting louder and louder, she realized with horror that it was coming from inside the house. She tried to find a place to hide, but every room seemed to be occupied by a different nightmare. In one room, there was a shadowy figure lurking in the corner. In another, there were strange, ghostly apparitions floating through the air. And in the basement, she found a door that led to a dark, twisting maze of tunnels. As she stumbled through the tunnels, Sarah felt a sense of dread growing inside her. She knew that something terrible was waiting for her at the end of the maze, but she couldn't turn back. She had to keep going. At last, she emerged into a large, cavernous room. In the center of the room stood a figure shrouded in darkness. As Sarah approached, the figure stepped forward into the light, revealing itself to be a grotesque monster with razor-sharp teeth and glowing eyes. Sarah screamed and tried to run, but the monster was too fast. It grabbed her by the neck and lifted her off the ground, its teeth bared in a savage grin. As Sarah struggled to break free, she realized that the monster was not just a physical threat. It was feeding on her fear, drawing strength from her terror. She closed her eyes and tried to block out the fear, but it was no use. The monster was too powerful. Just as Sarah was about to give up hope, she heard a voice calling out to her from the darkness. It was a voice she recognized, the voice of her mother, who had passed away years ago. The voice filled her with a sense of calm and reassurance, and Sarah found the strength to break free from the monster's grasp. She ran back through the tunnels, back into the house, and out into the night. As she stood on the porch, gasping for breath, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had survived the monster's attack, but she knew that it was still out there, waiting in the darkness, ready to strike again. Jenna and her friends had always been curious about the old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. They had heard rumors of strange occurrences there, and they were determined to investigate for themselves. One dark and stormy night, they gathered outside the mansion, their flashlights illuminating the overgrown garden. They pushed open the creaky gate and made their way towards the front door. As they stepped inside, they felt a chill run down their spines. The air was thick with an ominous silence, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the dusty floorboards. They explored the first floor, finding nothing out of the ordinary. But as they climbed the stairs to the second floor, they heard a faint whispering sound coming from one of the rooms. It was a sound that sent shivers down their spines. Jenna's friend, Alex, cautiously pushed open the door to the room. Inside, they saw an old-fashioned nursery, complete with a rocking chair, a crib, and a dresser. But what caught their attention was the ghostly figure of a woman in a white gown, standing beside the crib. The figure slowly turned to face them, revealing her pale face and empty eyes. Jenna and her friends froze in terror as the figure began to move towards them, her gown trailing behind her. They tried to run, but their feet seemed to be glued to the floor. The figure drew closer and closer, until it was only a few feet away. And then, suddenly, it vanished, leaving them alone in the darkness. Jenna and her friends tried to shake off the fear and continued to explore the mansion. But as they descended the stairs to the first floor, they heard a loud crash coming from the room they had just left. They rushed back to the nursery, only to find that the rocking chair was now rocking back and forth on its own, and the dresser drawers were opening and closing by themselves. The room was filled with a sense of malevolent energy, and Jenna and her friends realized that they were in grave danger. They tried to leave the mansion, but the door was stuck shut. As they frantically searched for a way out, they heard the sound of ghostly laughter coming from all around them. They knew that they were not alone in the mansion, and that they might never leave it alive. The mansion seemed to be alive, and it was determined to keep them trapped forever. Jenna and her friends were forced to confront the terrifying reality that they might become just another ghostly presence in the haunted mansion, forever trapped in its grasp. Jenna and her friends had always been curious about the old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. They had heard rumors of strange occurrences there, and they were determined to investigate for themselves. One dark and stormy night, they gathered outside the mansion, their flashlights illuminating the overgrown garden. They pushed open the creaky gate and made their way towards the front door. As they stepped inside, they felt a chill run down their spines. The air was thick with an ominous silence, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the dusty floorboards. They explored the first floor, finding nothing out of the ordinary, but as they climbed the stairs to the second floor, they heard a faint whispering sound coming from one of the rooms. It was a sound that sent shivers down their spines. Jenna's friend, Alex, cautiously pushed open the door to the room. Inside, they saw an old-fashioned nursery, complete with a rocking chair, a crib, and a dresser. But what caught their attention was the ghostly figure of a woman in a white gown, standing beside the crib. The figure slowly turned to face them, revealing her pale face and empty eyes. Jenna and her friends froze in terror as the figure began to move towards them, her gown trailing behind her. They tried to run, but their feet seemed to be glued to the floor. The figure drew closer and closer until it was only a few feet away. And then suddenly, it vanished, leaving them alone in the darkness. Jenna and her friends tried to shake off the fear and continued to explore the mansion. But as they descended the stairs to the first floor, they heard a loud crash coming from the room they had just left. They rushed back to the nursery, only to find that the rocking chair was now rocking back and forth on its own, and the dresser drawers were opening and closing by themselves. The room was filled with a sense of malevolent energy, and Jenna and her friends realized that they were in grave danger. They tried to leave the mansion, but the door was stuck shut. As they frantically searched for a way out, they heard the sound of ghostly laughter coming from all around them. They knew that they were not alone in the mansion, and that they might never leave it alive. The mansion seemed to be alive, and it was determined to keep them trapped forever. Jenna and her friends were forced to confront the terrifying reality that they might become just another ghostly presence in the haunted mansion, forever trapped in its grasp. Mark had always been fascinated by the old abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. It had once been a bustling hub of activity, but now it lay empty and silent, a relic of the past. One day, Mark decided to explore the factory for himself. He climbed over the rusted fence and made his way inside. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, and the only sound was the echoing of his footsteps. As he made his way deeper into the factory, he began to feel uneasy. The silence was oppressive, and the darkness seemed to be closing in around him, but he pushed on, determined to see what secrets the old factory held. As he turned a corner, he saw something that made him freeze in terror. A figure, dressed in overalls and a welding mask, was standing at the end of the hallway. It was staring directly at him. Mark tried to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The figure began to move towards him, its heavy footsteps echoing through the factory. Mark could hear the sound of metal scraping against metal as it drew closer. He tried to scream, but his voice was caught in his throat. The figure was almost upon him now, and he could see the glint of a sharp object in its hand. Just as the figure was about to strike, it vanished into thin air. Mark was left alone in the darkness, gasping for breath and shaking with fear. He quickly made his way back to the entrance of the factory, determined to get out of there as quickly as possible. But as he reached the door, he found it was locked. He was trapped inside. Mark frantically searched for another way out, but every door and window was sealed tight. He was alone in the factory with no way to escape. As the hours passed, Mark began to realize that he was not alone. He could hear whispers and footsteps echoing through the factory, and he could feel a presence watching him from the shadows. He knew that something was in the factory with him, something that wanted him dead. And as the darkness closed in around him, he realized that he might never make it out alive. Mark's curiosity had led him to a place of unspeakable horror, and now he was paying the price. The old factory held secrets that were best left undisturbed, and Mark had learned that lesson too late. A group of friends, Sarah, Jessica, Ryan, and David, decided to take a hike in the woods. They had heard stories about strange happenings in the woods, but they didn't believe in them. As they walked deeper into the woods, they began to notice that things were not as they seemed. The trees were twisted and gnarled, and the birds were eerily silent. They brushed it off as just their imagination and continued on. As they walked further, they came across an abandoned cabin. It looked as if it had been abandoned for years, with cobwebs covering the windows and the door hanging off its hinges. Against their better judgment, the group decided to investigate. As they stepped inside, they felt a cold breeze brush past them, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin. They quickly realized that they were not alone in the cabin. They could hear whispers and laughter coming from the shadows, and the feeling of a malevolent presence seemed to be closing in around them. As they tried to leave, they found that the door was stuck shut. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped inside the cabin. Just then, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from outside the cabin. It sounded like someone was being attacked by something inhuman. The group huddled together in fear. As the sound of the scream seemed to be getting closer and closer, they knew that they were not safe, and they had to get out of there. After what seemed like hours, the sound of the scream faded away. The group slowly made their way outside the cabin, only to find that they were in a completely different part of the woods. They were lost, and the woods seemed to be alive and moving around them. The trees were bending and twisting in unnatural ways, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to be shifting. As they walked on, they began to hear the sound of children's laughter. It was a sound that sent chills down their spines. The laughter seemed to be coming from all around them, and they couldn't tell where it was coming from. The group began to run, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew they had to get out of the woods before it was too late. But just as they thought they were safe, they saw it. A creature, unlike anything they had ever seen before, was standing in their path. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its mouth opened to reveal razor-sharp teeth. The group was frozen in terror as the creature began to move towards them. They knew they were in grave danger, and they might never leave the woods alive. Cameron had always been curious about the abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. It had been vacant for years, with rumors of strange happenings inside. One day he decided to explore the mansion for himself. As he entered the mansion, he was struck by the eerie silence that seemed to permeate the air. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he made his way through the empty halls. As he walked, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around, but there was no one there. The feeling of being watched made his skin crawl. As he continued to explore, he noticed that the portraits on the walls seemed to be following him with their eyes. He brushed it off as his imagination and continued on. But then he heard a voice whisper his name. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing moment. He tried to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He turned a corner and found himself face to face with a ghostly figure. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. Cameron ran as fast as he could, but the mansion seemed to have shifted around him. The walls and doors seemed to be closing in, trapping him inside. Just as he thought he was doomed, a door appeared out of nowhere. He rushed through it, only to find himself in a room filled with mirrors. The mirrors distorted his reflection, making him look twisted and grotesque. And then, as if by magic, the mirrors shattered into a million pieces. Cameron felt a sharp pain in his arm and looked down to see that he was bleeding. It was then that he realized that the mirrors had shattered into razor-sharp shards that had sliced through his skin. As he stumbled through the mansion, trying to find a way out, he heard the sound of laughter echoing through the halls. It was a sound that made his blood run cold. He knew that he was not alone in the mansion, and that something was coming for him. He could feel its presence getting closer with each passing moment. Just as he thought he was going to die, he saw a light at the end of the hallway. He rushed towards it, bursting through the door and stumbling out into the sunlight. Cameron collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. He had never been so scared in his life, and as he looked back at the mansion, he could feel the weight of its dark history still lingering over him. It was a dark and stormy night, and Jessica was driving home from a late shift at the hospital. As she drove down the deserted highway, she suddenly heard a strange noise coming from under the hood of her car. She pulled over to the side of the road to check it out. As she lifted the hood, she saw that the engine was smoking. She tried to call for help, but there was no signal on her phone. She was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no one to turn to. As the rain poured down around her, she noticed a faint light in the distance. It looked like a small cabin, nestled in the woods. She decided to brave the storm and make her way there. As she approached the cabin, she noticed that the front door was ajar. She cautiously pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and musty, with old furniture and cobwebs everywhere. As she explored the cabin, she heard strange noises coming from the basement. She made her way down the creaky stairs, and as she reached the bottom, the door slammed shut behind her. Jessica was trapped, with no way out. She heard the sound of footsteps coming closer, and her heart pounded in her chest. Suddenly, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness. Jessica tried to run, but the figure grabbed her by the arm and dragged her into a small room. It was filled with strange objects like skulls and potions. The figure revealed itself to be a witch, and she had been waiting for someone like Jessica to arrive. The witch began to chant in a strange language, and Jessica could feel a chill running down her spine. As the ritual continued, the cabin began to shake, and the walls started to crack. Jessica was convinced that she was going to die. Suddenly, the door burst open and a group of villagers rushed in. They had been searching for the witch for years and had finally found her. As they battled the witch, Jessica tried to escape, but as she ran up the stairs, she realized that the cabin was on fire. The witch had cast a spell that had set the place ablaze. Jessica stumbled outside, coughing and gasping for air. She watched in horror as the cabin burned to the ground, taking the witch and all of her dark magic with it. As she drove away, Jessica realized that she had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, and she knew that she would never forget the terror she had experienced that night, alone in the woods with the witch. It was a dark and stormy night, and Anna was driving home from a friend's house. As she drove down the deserted road, she noticed a strange figure standing on the side of the road. She slowed down to get a better look, but the figure suddenly disappeared. Anna shrugged it off as her imagination and continued driving. But as she turned onto her street, she noticed the figure again. This time it was closer, and she could see that it was a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes. As Anna pulled into her driveway, the figure disappeared once again. But as she got out of her car, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around, but no one was there. Anna quickly made her way inside her house, locked the door, and turned on all the lights. She tried to shake off the feeling of unease that was settling over her, but it only grew stronger. As she sat down on her couch, she noticed something moving outside her window. She approached the window slowly and saw the same figure staring back at her. Anna was terrified, and she quickly backed away from the window. But as she turned around, she saw the figure standing in her living room. The figure revealed himself to be a ghost, and he told Anna that he had been murdered in the house many years ago. He had been trying to communicate with the living for years, but no one had been able to hear him. Anna was frozen with fear, and she didn't know what to do. But as she looked closer at the ghost, she realized that he wasn't alone. There were more ghosts all around her. The ghosts began to close in on her, and Anna could feel their cold breath on her neck. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The ghosts were taking her, dragging her into their realm. Anna woke up the next morning, convinced that it had all been a nightmare. But as she looked in the mirror, she saw that her face was different. It was pale and translucent, just like a ghost. Anna realized with horror that the ghosts had taken her soul, and she was now one of them. She was trapped in their realm, forever doomed to haunt the living. From that day on, Anna's house was known as the most haunted place in town, and no one ever dared to enter it again. The Johnson family had just moved into their new home in the countryside. It was a beautiful old farmhouse with a sprawling lawn and a picturesque barn. The family couldn't wait to settle in and start their new life. On the first night, they sat down to dinner, but they were interrupted by strange noises coming from the basement. Mr. Johnson went down to investigate, but he found nothing out of the ordinary. As the days went on, strange things continued to happen. Objects would move on their own, and doors would slam shut by themselves. The family tried to ignore it, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, the family was awakened by loud banging on the front door. When they went to check, they found a strange old woman standing on their porch. She had a wild look in her eyes and was muttering to herself. The family tried to calm her down and offer her some help, but she refused to come inside. She warned them that the house was cursed and that they should leave before it was too late. The Johnsons dismissed the old woman's warnings, thinking that she was just a crazy old lady. But as time passed, they began to realize that something was seriously wrong with their new home. They started seeing strange apparitions in the house, including a little girl in a white dress who would appear and disappear without warning. The family tried to leave, but they found that they were trapped in the house. The doors and windows wouldn't budge, and the phones were dead. One night, as the family was huddled together in fear, they heard a voice whispering from the darkness. It was the voice of the old woman they had seen on their porch. She told them that the house was built on an ancient burial ground and that the spirits of the dead were angry and seeking revenge. The family realized too late that they had awakened a malevolent force and they were in grave danger. The ghostly presence in the house grew stronger and stronger until it was all-encompassing. The family could feel cold breath on their necks and see apparitions moving in the darkness. In the end, the Johnsons never made it out of the house alive. Their bodies were found days later, locked inside the old farmhouse. To this day, no one knows what happened to them or what evil force still lurks within those walls.